Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about the topic of narcissism, and this has been requested for a while. It comes up a lot, especially in relation to relationships. And the problem with this topic, from my perspective, is that a lot of it gets misrepresented, especially online. The use of certain terms and actually just understanding what true narcissism actually equates to. So I'm probably going to do this over two parts. I think when I talk a bit about the actual term, the actual diagnosis, and then give actionable tools, skills, and input on how to recover if you've ever been in a relationship like this, or if you're dealing with maybe a sibling, a friend, a partner, co-parenting with somebody like this. So today I'm just going to unpack the actual label, because that's what we're talking about, of narcissism. The concept of narcissism, can be traced back to its origins in the Greek myth of Narcissus. I hope I'm saying that right. And that was a mythological figure who, in the story, fell in love with his own reflection. And Narcissus' mother was told by a blind seer that he would have a long life provided he never recognised himself. However, his rejection of the love of a nymph called Echo, or I think there's another version where he falls in love with a young man, drew upon him the vengeance of the gods. So he fell in love with his own reflection in the waters of a spring, and he pined away or killed himself. So the story may have derived from the ancient Greek superstition that it was unlucky or even fatal to see one's own reflection. So I don't know how accurate that is. It's just what I've read around the origins of the topic. So it was first coined as a mental disorder in 1898 by H. Ellis in a study around autoeroticism, in which he described a narcissist-like tendency to absorb sexual feelings into self-admiration. He also identified pathological self-absorption, inflated self-image, addiction to fantasy, and observing a composed, cool demeanour that is only rocked when the person's confidence is in threat. Manipulation and exploitation of others was also observed and identified. So Freud also mentioned narcissism in a paper that he wrote called On Narcissism, and he outlined the connection and relationship between narcissism and inferiority. Now, that might not be the topic that immediately springs to mind when you think of narcissism, but he suggested that it was ego wounding, and the impoverishment of the ego contributed to feelings of inferiority. So narcissism refers to a dimension that ranges from healthy, the pathological, the enduring narcissistic personality disorder, and it's identified by the degree of severity, the dominance of aggression versus shame, and the extent to which it is manifested, the behaviour, whether it's overt or it's internally hidden, i.e. covert. So I'm going to dive into this topic, and some of these bits and pieces of information might be a wee bit confusing at times, but I'll do my best to explain it, because as I say, there's a lot of different terms that are used to find elements of behaviour. So when we talk about narcissism commonly, what comes to mind in terms of behaviour? And that's really what I'm going to be talking about now. So personality traits of what's known as grandiosity, and that's a term you're going to hear me talk about a lot in this episode. So it could be really referring to excessive self-absorption, a pathological, grandiose self characterised by aggression, a sense of superiority, and uniqueness. We could also be talking about attention-seeking behaviour, difficulty in relating to others, interpersonal relationships. However, they can adapt socially, although there would be a clear indication of entitlement. Behaviour of devaluing others, being contemptuous of others, and depreciating others. So relationships are somewhat exploitative. That would be really what we're getting at there. The person would be prone to mood swings and an inability to regulate their emotions, and that's key. And also you could observe less integrated sense of values if we were looking at this on a deeper level. Using other people, as I just mentioned, they excessively regulate their own self-esteem. And that's something that's going to come up again and again as we unpack this. Seeing themselves with an inflated sense of self, seeing themselves as exceptional, special, unique. And one of the research articles I was reading, they were talking about the origins of some of the terminology, and they talked about like a God complex And I think that's kind of fitting at times, because this idea of exceptional uniqueness, specialness, godlike delusion, and how they see themselves in it, that doesn't have to even merit accomplishment or anything like that. Impaired ability to have empathy towards people and a lack of remorse for others. So I'm sure there's people that have listened to this podcast that have been on the receiving end of an individual like that. Superficial relationships, no depth. They serve a purpose of bolstering the sense of self. So they're ultimately very using. Being overly concerned with maintaining the excessive positive sense of self. So that's a crucial theme. How they're being perceived, how they're being admired or adored, and that identity around that. Now, when we talk about narcissism as well, it's nearly impossible to not mention manipulative behavior. So I just want to preface that manipulative behavior would include projected insecurities, gaslighting. Now, I'm going to talk a wee bit more about gaslighting near the end because I think it's important. Silent treatment and stonewalling, again, another very damaging form of manipulation. Playing the victim for attention, to guilt, or to coerce or control. Excluding or leaving crucial pieces of information absent from stories, either to gain influence, praise, admiration, or to control. Intimidating someone with body language, behavior, yelling or screaming in their face. Withholding affection to control or punish and to compliance. Shaming someone about their appearance, either through comparison or to demean, belittle them. Guilting them. So obviously we could expand on elements of manipulative behavior in context, but it's just important that we define that. When we talk about narcissism and narcissistic individuals, we're also identifying someone who is highly attuned to discerning feedback from those around them as it relates to them. And that will ultimately dictate aspects of their behavior. You know, they know how to read situations. They know how to position themselves in certain ways and around certain people. They want to know that people admire them so that they can feel superior. Now, being liked is not as important to them as being admired or feeling superior. So within that, there's a theme of self-aggrandizing comments, shameless self-promotion. So think bragging, but it can also lead to them putting others down. If they're ever challenged or questioned, it can lead to very angry outbursts. And really what we're talking about again is an exaggerated sense of self. Now, these individuals very often can't take or deal with criticism in a healthy way. So when we're talking about that ability to regulate the sense of self or the self-esteem, criticism is something that is a big trigger. They can be very arrogant, conceited, domineering, controlling, entitled, manipulative, as we mentioned. Fantasies or delusions of power, adulation, and as I mentioned, not necessarily without achievement. You know, they don't have to have actually accomplished anything to have these notions about themselves. You might see themes of rage, anger, jealousy, envy, and outbursts of this when they get frustrated or challenged. Mentioned there earlier, lack of remorse for behavior, lack of trust of others, and exploitation of others, needing attention, praise, and validation. They need to feel important, superior, in control, powerful, and see themselves as a success. Now, they can be very articulate, intelligent, well-presenting, even hiding behind charitable behavior. Outwardly facing, they may even appear to be a publicly upstanding member of community. However, when you look at behavior in their interpersonal relationships, it may show a theme of the deeper rooted personality issue. They might only behave in a kind or charitable way when it's to be seen doing so, i.e. to be the best parent, the best member of the parent-teacher association, whatever the fuck it might be. However, they might actually neglect or bully their kids behind closed doors. They might have a sadistic streak in them. They might talk about how good they are to their children, but the contrast in terms of the behavior behind closed doors might be night and day. They may initially appear very confident and attractive. However, within the scope of a relationship, people will soon unearth a hostile, arrogant, and sometimes aggressive aspect of the personality. So the above traits are usually consistent and stable over a period of time. Now, there is, you know, as I was going through some reading around this, narcissistic personality disorder, and there's also subtypes of narcissistic personality type. So some individuals might have most or a lot of the characteristics that we described above of NPD, but it would be within a slightly normal range of personality. And that's the thing, when we talk about narcissism, And I'll touch on this later. There's what's known as a healthy spectrum of narcissism, and then there's what we call pathological, where there's clinical problems here. And it was noted in a study in 2008, they found a higher lifetime prevalence rate in men, 7.7%, and 4.8% in women. However, I do think from what I was reading, and definitely through experience working with relationship, it isn't as common as people would like to believe. And for the people that have family members or have had marriages or relationships with these kinds of individuals, true NPD is debilitating. It's also very debilitating for that individual. It's debilitating for the whole system connected to that person. And it is a term that gets thrown around quite a lot. So why do some people develop those traits? How does it happen? And there was a few Austrian psychoanalysts that claimed, the origins of how this can develop can happen in childhood experience. So basically disturbance or early childhood trauma in the parent-child attachment or bond can lead to that narcissistic personality becoming developed. So it's a defect in the development of a healthy sense of self. It's a nice way of thinking about it. Because the parent-child relationship obviously didn't meet a need on some level. It wasn't able to model healthy behavior and attachment needs, which would have allowed the child's self to develop and gain maturity in a healthy way. So they would have been able to learn healthier ways to relate to others. Empathetic parents will teach children a more realistic sense of self rather than them internalizing an unattainable or unrealistic sense of self that would be impossible to attain. So problems are introduced when the parent is unempathetic and fails to provide approval and appropriate role models or behavior being modeled. So according to Kohut, I hope I'm pronouncing this person's name right, narcissism is in effect a developmental arrest. So it's a halt in the child's development of what was a normal and essential stage. And the result is that the child's self remains grandiose and unrealistic. However, at the same time, the child continues to idealize others to maintain the sense of self-esteem through association. There was another definition I came across earlier, and it was really good. It was a pervasive pattern of fluctuating and vulnerable self-esteem, which ranges from grandiosity and assertiveness to inferiority and insecurity, with self-enhancing and self-serving interpersonal behavior, intense reactions to perceived threats, beginning in early adulthood, and it's present in a variety of contexts. It's also been suggested that some people can develop this trait due to early childhood experiences laden with trauma, excessive levels of parental criticism, abuse, neglect, and emotional injury over time that wounds the sense of self. And this can lead to overwhelming feelings of shame. And that might not be the first thing that you think about when you think of narcissists, because we tend to think of these really... That's the dog. Yeah. You might think of very confident individuals, very assertive, very, outwardly have their shit together, that false facade in the beginning of that superiority, that way that they hold themselves. But it's important that we look at what's actually beneath the hood of what might be going on with that person. And Terry Real has spoken about this before when he was talking about it with men, this idea of swinging between two states of grandiosity and intense shame. And the fluctuation between intense feelings of shame and inadequacy can lead for them moving between that state of grandiosity and inflated self-promotion, but it's really there to buffer against the feelings of not enoughness and inadequacy. And although the sense of self-esteem and confidence appears high, they can also struggle with really low self-esteem and chronic shame. Chronic shame states that they will fluctuate between that and grandiosity, and that can be moment to moment, day to day. They may feel very good about themselves and how they see themselves consciously. However, some research has suggested that on an unconscious level, they tend to have much harsher judgments of the sense of self and lower self-esteem, which indicates that on an unconscious level, the feelings about the self are not so positive. So I think that's an important thing to kind of keep in your mind. And again, we're not looking at this from a place of judgment or, trying to fully rationalize or reason away why these kinds of people are the way they are. Like, we can look at it as even intergenerational trauma, and we could talk about heritability, if you have a parent like this, and then it's in the family of origin, and what's the likelihood of somebody growing up and becoming someone like this. Or we can talk about abuse and neglect and trauma, and we can talk about how all these might contribute to this type of behavior going on. But I wanted to talk about this just in an informative way, just so that it's understood as well that at the core, we're also dealing with people. When we're talking about true NPD, we're talking about people that have like psychiatric issues. There's a proper element of this person also being debilitated by how they relate in the world, or their inability to relate in the world might be a better way of putting it. And I'm not sure if this is the American Psychiatric Association or it was on the DSM anyway, but the criteria for NPD included grandiose sense of self, importance, preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited power, success, brilliance, beauty, ideal love, a belief that the person is special or unique, can only be understood by and should associate with other special or high status people or institutions, a need for excessive admiration, a sense of entitlement, interpersonal exploitativeness, a lack of envy, a lack of empathy, often envious of others, beliefs that others are envious of him, her, and arrogant, haughty behaviours or attitudes. I think that sums it up very well. So just carrying on with the grandiosity conversation, that is a core component of narcissistic personality. So repressing negative aspects of self, and any information that comes in is distorted that this confirms how they feel about themselves. So this can lead to entitled attitudes, the inflated self-image. And as I mentioned earlier, they might not actually have accomplished fuck all. They might not have certain skills or achievements. However, they will regularly engage in fantasies of unlimited power, superiority, perfection, and adulation. Narcissistic grandiosity is often expressed behaviorally through interpersonal exploitative acts, lack of empathy, I keep confusing that with envy, intense envy, aggression, and sometimes exhibitionism. This may also be covertly enacted. So, how would you describe covert? Covert's like done subtly, like kind of hidden, covertly enacted by providing instrumental and emotional support to others, but concurrently harboring contempt for the person being helped and secretly experiencing the situation as reflecting one's own specialness, goodness, or superior capabilities. And I touched on that earlier about these individuals that, they appear to be very wholesome. They appear to be very upstanding members of the community. As I mentioned there, they could be part of that PTA association. They could be the member of the community group that's just trying to help out and all that kind of carry on. But the thing is, behind closed doors, the behavior doesn't actually match this identity that's being created. If they're being charitable, it's not about the actual giving. It could be about how much they're given or being seen to be given. Positioning themselves as a good parent, but actually neglecting or denying that their child has needs. Everything's still going to be about them. It's still going to be self-centered around them. And sometimes these individuals can fly under the radar because elements of their behavior and the identity that they have crafted makes them look very altruistic, makes them look a certain way. But again, just touching on what we said there, secretly harboring contempt for maybe the people that they're helping, and that this behavior just confirms that idea of specialness or goodness or those superior aspects of self. And those grandiose themes are emphasized, in some of the reading that I was doing. They've broken it down into two other descriptors: the arrogant narcissist and what's known as the psychopathic narcissist. And I'm also cautious. I don't want to be like firing terms out. This is just through some of the research and the reading that I was doing. But there is definitions that kind of separate them. So the arrogant narcissist copes with self-esteem dysregulation by creating an exaggerated sense of superiority and uniqueness, as well as by engaging in grandiose fantasies. These individuals exhibit entitlement, exploitiveness, a lack of empathy, and experience intense envy and aggression as a result of what's known as behavioral dysregulation. The psychopathic narcissist copes with self-esteem dysregulation by engaging in antisocial behaviors to protect or enhance their inflated self-image. These individuals may commit violent criminal acts in order to gain admiration from others, display extreme rage reactions to criticism, and are interpersonally sadistic without experiencing remorse or empathy. Now, when we're talking about somebody like that, that is not commonplace in society as far as I'm aware. So again, when we're talking about pathological narcissism, we are talking about somebody on a psychiatric level who is not well, who could potentially be a danger to themselves or others, especially when we're talking about it in that context. But when we're also talking about this idea of arrogant narcissism and those themes of grandiosity, it's important to talk about that idea of the shame state, and this is what has been known as narcissistic vulnerability, right? This is the other state that is being fluctuated from. So the descriptor of narcissistic vulnerability is dysfunction that is characterized by a depleted or an enfeebled self-image, angry, shameful, depressed behavior, self-critical, and suicidality. Again, interpersonal hypersensitivity and often social withdrawal. So it was in the psychodynamic diagnostic manual. Now, I hope I say this person's name right, but this Roningston went on and defined this as shy narcissists, not a term that you would immediately think of with narcissism. But again, talking about narcissistic vulnerability, shy narcissists deal with self-esteem dysregulation by engaging in grandiose fantasy while also feeling intense shame regarding their needs and ambition. So the dominant effect problem for shy narcissists is shame rather than envy or aggression, and they avoid interpersonal relationships because of hypersensitivity to rejection and criticism. So clinical studies with narcissistic patients have indicated that they virtually will always exhibit both covert and overt grandiosity, as well as covert and overt vulnerability. So swinging from that shame state and that grandiose state, they will display covert and overt behavior. And that's important to recognize. Now, one of the things I will say that became very interesting with the reading around this is the actual diagnostic criteria and the methods that they use to ascertain the nature of some things being quite limited. And that's a whole other conversation, but it also speaks to the complexity of the actual condition. And I think as a term, and I'll talk about this later, when we define something as narcissistic, we are talking about that arrogance, that conceitedness, that inflated sense of self, all the above behavior that was mentioned. But we're also talking about it within a spectrum, and we're talking about pathological narcissism, and we're talking about this in terms of true NPD as a disorder. We're also talking about something very, very debilitating, not only for the individual, but also for the people connected to that system. And one way to think about it when we're talking about pathological narcissism is the narcissistic grandiosity, and then that narcissistic vulnerability. So that idea of the shame state, that idea of that shy narcissist, and then narcissistic grandiosity, where we could be talking about that arrogant narcissist or that more dangerous, what did I call it? The pathological? Was it the pathological? Psychopathic narcissist, which again is probably extremely less commonplace in society. So we're talking about the type, grandiosity and vulnerability. We're talking then about expression. Is it overt or covert? On a clinical level, those suffering with NPD have problems with axis 1 disorders, which include psychopathy, interpersonal problems, relational dysfunction, which again is a theme we can see in all their interpersonal behaviors, substance use abuse, aggression, sexual aggression, impulsivity, potential homicidal ideation, parasuicidal and suicidal behaviors. So we're talking about a lot of heavy stuff, and we're actually talking about true NPD, and this is what I'm saying about the misrepresentation sometimes of these terms. I would also be very curious to look at if there was more research done on expression, across gender between male and female, what has been observed, what has been studied in terms of behavior, how it shows up. I think that would be a relatively interesting topic. And I think it would also be worth exploring what is considered normal or even healthy narcissism, if there is such a thing. So again, narcissism can be thought of as one's ability to maintain a relatively positive self-image. It underlies an individual's need for validation and affirmation, as well as the motivation to overtly and covertly seek out self-enhancement experiences from the social environment. Now, I think it was Pincus 2009. So there's some of the stuff I'm directly quoting because I think they've hit the nail on the head. Most theorists suggest narcissism has both normal and pathological expression. So again, when we talk pathological, we're talking about, more serious expressions, where they need clinical intervention, which reflects adaptive and maladaptive personality, psychological needs, regulatory mechanisms, and giving rise to individual differences and managing needs for self-enhancement and validation. So it's the way in which they go about trying to regulate the self-esteem. That's probably I can't really speak, probably an easier way of defining that aspect of narcissism. So normal narcissism supports a certain interpersonal dominance, feeling achievement and mastery, competitiveness, positive illusions about the self, and filtering out or minimizing any information that doesn't fit the positive self-image. People may embody a higher level of ambition, often satisfied, successful. However, this may be at the cost, again, of interpersonal relationships and being seen as a disagreeable person. So this could be, even in some of the higher levels of society, like politicians and the corporate world, some of the people that have some of those more ambitious and ruthless traits in terms of what they're prepared to do in order to get ahead. And that's, at the cost of some of their interpersonal relationships, that drive, that motivation, that idea of the self. All individuals have normal narcissistic needs and motives. However, pathologically narcissistic individuals appear particularly troubled when faced with disappointments and threats to their positive self-image. And I think that's important to discern. So we were talking about that earlier. They may appear cool and composed until somebody challenges the fantasy or the idea of how they see themselves, or something doesn't break in their favor, or doesn't go their way, or doesn't confirm how they see themselves. And that can lead to these bigger outbursts of anger, of rage, of jealousy, or of envy, or all those different things. And so no one's perfect. The world is constantly changing. Challenges are constantly being put out in our path. But pathological narcissism involves the person significantly struggling to regulate how they see themselves, how they cope with disappointments, and how they manage threats to the sense of self. Pathological narcissism differs from healthy or normal narcissism, since the self-regulation is dysfunctional. This is aiming to protect the fragile self through the aspects of grandiosity. The behavior is different, and there is clear difficulties in being able to regulate their feelings, specifically anger, shame, and envy. Their interpersonal relationships are a reflection of this individual trying to bolster or enhance their self-esteem, and other people are used in this way at the cost of intimacy and normal relational experience. So that was a lot. There was a lot on that. And there's so much more that I think I could dive into. I just wanted to give that overview. Firstly, just to define it, to talk about the actual differences when we're talking about NPD and that idea of grandiosity, shame, expression through overt and covert behavior. Overt is basically where it's so much more noticeable. Covert's where a lot of the actual agenda is hidden. And then just talking about what is considered healthy and what's not. One of the key takeaways for anybody that's listening to this is that the knowledge of the topic is definitely important. And many people will often fall into the trap of defining abusive behavior by labeling people with these terms. He or she's such a fucking narcissist, they're X, Y, and Z. And you know what? There are people out there who have been on the receiving end of NPD abuse. Absolutely. It could be a parent, as I mentioned, it could be their first intimate relationship. It could be a boss. It could be a friend. It could be any member in society where they've crossed somebody like this. For those that have experienced true NPD, they are in no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that this person has displayed aspects of the criteria that I mentioned in this podcast, because they will know through the relational experiences over time. There's a consistent theme. There's a consistency to their interpersonal relationships with other people as well. And it's not an easy cycle to break, because, as I mentioned, if it's in the family of origin, it could be a parent. I've also seen it, where it's a parent seeking help for an adult child that has NPD. And it's heartbreaking because it affects the entire system. It affects all interpersonal relationships, as I mentioned. It's very difficult to have healthy boundaries. It's very difficult to maintain contact and connection. Very often, in my experience with working with people and through some of the stories that I've heard, a lot of people eventually go no contact. A lot of the time for a safety reason. As I mentioned, other people have experienced it in the container of a relationship. And that has had massive, massive impacts. There's some people that won't do it for years after they've had a narcissistic relationship, because it really does in every way affect the identity, how the person sees themselves, the level of abusive behavior that they experience. Because we're not talking about minor things. We were talking about manipulation. We were talking about intimidation. We were talking about being demeaned, disregarded. We're talking about an individual that can make you feel like the whole world one second and a piece of shit the next. We're talking about somebody who could be engaging in gaslighting, affecting your sense of reality, your ability to trust yourself, how you see yourself in the world, affecting all your relationships, isolating you, all those different things. So it's not a very easy thing to heal from, and it takes time. It genuinely does take time. But what I'm really getting at within this is, for those people that have had abusive relationships, sometimes it's not helpful to fixate on a label. And it's coming from it can sometimes be coming from a healthy and a loving place. It's like, well, I want to make other people aware that this individual's like this. And I fucking totally get it. But what is really crucially important is that we first acknowledge that the container of the relationship was abusive, that abusive behavior was present, and that there was obvious clear indications and red flags. And that's the thing. It was an abusive relationship that you run. Call it what it was, an abusive relationship. Because fixating on a label, whether it's appropriate or not, you still have to unpack and acknowledge the impact of the behavior. And sometimes that's more important for your own healing than getting fixated on a label, right? And the reason I'm saying that is sometimes when you're dealing with a narcissism, you might find yourself on the opposite end of that behavior where they're projecting all the shit that they've done to you, they're accusing you of having done to them. They're playing the victim. They're continuing to wound you after you've left that relationship. And the reason we very often will go no contact, and once you're out, you don't feed the fucking monster, you don't give it any more energy, is because very often they're thriving off the drama. Very often they're thriving off the ability to still have influence and control over your sense of self. They're still getting something from that. There's still a power balance at play. And we're still dealing with an abusive individual. We're still dealing with an abusive relationship. Whether it's true NPD or not, we're still talking about abuse being perpetuated. And this is the thing, your healing is what's most crucial in that scenario. And it's about recognizing, right, there was harm caused, there was abuse caused. How do I safeguard myself? How do I heal from this? How do I take care of myself so that this can't happen again going forward? And that might have to come in the early stages of letting go of that idea of, attaching a label to that person, other people seeing that person for who they are. Because the truth in my eyes is that they can't hide who they are forever. If it is true NPD that we're talking about, or if we're talking about even somebody that's just very narcissistic, the mask will eventually slip and they'll do it again with somebody. Could be on a bigger scale. It might be 5 years, maybe 2 years, maybe a year, maybe 6 months. It doesn't matter. You're out of the circus. You're away from that scenario. Your responsibility post-breakup with somebody like that, or getting out of a system that's like that, is in healing yourself and safeguarding yourself against further abuse. That is front and center the most important thing. Getting help to attend to the trauma, getting help to attend to all the wounding to the self and the identity, trying to get the nervous system regulated, trying to get yourself back, trusting yourself, building your identity back up, and recognizing and exploring potentially in a therapeutic container, how the fuck did I find myself in a relationship or in a dance with somebody like that? Looking at how did I cope, what worked, what didn't work, unpacking all the dynamics of the relationship from start to finish. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to come through all the shit, but like looking at any themes, repetitions that were there that can lead to learning. So you'll never find yourself in a scenario like this, building yourself back up, as I mentioned, taking the time to actually do this before, you go back out into the world, dating or allow somebody else back into your space. Because again, that nervous system safety piece is huge. You have to really trust yourself again. And when you've dealt with an individual like that, that can really fracture the sense of self. So you need to take the time to do that. And look, there's a whole lot that I've spoken about just within this one piece. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's so many elements of this which would be fascinating, like looking at it within the family. That's a whole topic of conversation in itself. I see very often a lot of women seeking help for narcissistic mothers. Obviously, the mother-daughter dynamic is very, very painful. I've seen it with narcissistic fathers. I've seen it where it's mums seeking help for narcissistic daughters. I've seen a lot of different dynamics over the years, and they're all horrendously painful. They're very complex. When we're talking about true NPD, the safety piece is crucial. It's because, there's so much harm that's caused by not knowing what way to engage with this. And it's also recognizing that if we are talking about pathological clinical NPD, we're talking about somebody that's not well. We're talking about somebody that can't regulate their behavior. And is also potentially very dangerous in how they might conduct themselves, to themselves and to others. I spoke about that expression of gender. Is there more subtle differences between male or female? It would be interesting to explore that. And I think, again, as I said, I think some of the terms being thrown about in modern society, especially online, when people are using it so loosely, that person's a narcissist, or this and that and all the rest of it. Look, somebody can be self-absorbed, somebody can be arrogant, entitled, somebody can be on a spectrum of those things. And yes, narcissism is probably an appropriate element of defining aspects of how they're behaving. But when somebody's like got clinical narcissism, we're talking about something else, and we're actually diluting the term when we throw it around casually. And it's the same as gaslighting. Somebody disagreeing with you is not the same as gaslighting. Somebody intentionally debilitating and damaging your grasp of reality, your trust in yourself, even your feeling or your gauge of reality. That is a much more serious reflection of gaslighting. It's not the same as somebody not agreeing with you. It's not the same as somebody having a different perception of something. It's a lot of this is about intention and consistent attack on your grasp of reality over time. And there's a big element of that's connected to control, and influence in a negative, coercive, and abusive way. That's what we're fucking talking about. That's a very specific way of defining gaslighting. It's not the same as somebody disagreeing with you or not liking what you have to say. However, I do think sometimes, and it is quite frustrating when I've worked with people that have been on the receiving end of this, and I can see the damage and the impact that it's caused the sense of self, because it's crushing. It actually is absolutely crushing. And it dilutes the severity of what we're talking about when that term's misused. I feel like I'm going to do another episode just talking more on practical things that you can do if you're dealing with somebody like this, whether it's in the family or if you're recovering from a relationship, and you're trying to unpack these kinds of wounds. And I'd like to talk a wee bit about some good resources and reading that you could look at if you are in the recovery from these kinds of relationships. But what I will say just on that is get help. Like, actually get help. Allow yourself to go and seek support. You deserve to heal from these kinds of relationships. They can have a lasting impact. They can totally derail you and your ability to go out and trust people, to trust yourself, to navigate life, to have a healthy vision or sense of self. But it is a reflection of how that person has treated you. You do not need to carry these wounds going forward. You can have happy and fulfilling relationships even after having gone out with somebody who's behaved in this way. It'll take time. Working with regulating the nervous system is such a big piece, clearing the trauma. And working with somebody that's skilled and being able to do this is so fucking important, because there's a way of working with trauma. There's an effective way of taking somebody through this and unpacking it without destabilizing them, without making it worse. So do your research, check out that you're accessing people that are knowledgeable and experienced in working with these kinds of issues, and allow yourself to go and heal. It's a big fucking deal. It can transform your life when you've moved past something like this. You don't have to carry this for the rest of your life. And if it's somebody in your family, or if it's an in-law, or if it's somebody like that, it's really good to have that therapeutic container to actually think out loud about how you're experiencing this, how this has affected you, and to explore strategies to be able to navigate this in a more effective way, because it's fucking all-consuming when you're in it and you're dealing with it. And this is the thing, you don't have to go this alone. You can get help and support. You can work through this in a safe container, and it doesn't have to continue on as it always has. So just want to say thanks very much for everybody that listened to the podcast and for sharing it with people. If you have any topics that you would like me to talk about going forward, please DM. I just want to say thanks for listening and Happy New Year.